All right, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Today, we'll be covering some ways you can optimize grant management in Sage Intacct. And just a brief agenda of what we'll be going over today. We're going to cover an introduction to myself and to CBiz and an overview of our org. The bulk of our time today will be spent in a demo environment in Intacct, specifically highlighting some grant functionality. And then we'll also be speaking to why Sage Intacct, and then we'll save about 5 to 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. If there's anything that we don't have time to answer, if there's anything we can't answer today, or if you think of questions after the fact, there will be a slide with contact information at the end of our presentation. So a brief introduction to myself. My name's Jane. I'm the consulting manager on our Sage Intacct team at CBiz, and I've been implementing Intacct for about 5 years, and I was an end user prior to getting into implementation. As far as CBiz goes, we've been a Sage partner for 30 plus years, and for 12 plus of those years, we've been an Intacct partner. And then we have a team of certified Sage consultants and developers. And at the bottom of the slide here, you're just going to see some accolades. In 2024, we were a Bob Scott Top 100 VAR and an Accounting Today VAR. So I'll go ahead and switch over to my demo environment. Let me turn off my video for this piece. All righty. Okay, so hopefully this is large enough for everyone to see here. The features around grants and Intacct are very massive, and so we're not going to be able to cover every single little piece of grants management and Intacct, but we'll be able to touch on a lot of it. And again, just plug any of your questions into the chat, and then we'll jump on those in the last 5 to 10 minutes of today's session. So first of all, there are really, if you're an organization that's receiving grants, there are really 2 main features that are going to help you with grant compliance. Option 1 is just utilizing the grant dimension. So if I come into my Intacct environment here and I come out to my grants, I'm going to see that in this particular demo environment, I've got 41 grants listed. Now, I have the ability with just simply having these grants in a dimension in Intacct, I have the ability to tag transactions to these grants. And so this will really satisfy basic grant tracking requirements, and it's honestly really easy to do. So for example, if I wanted to tag a transaction to any one of these grants, I would be able to tag the line level of that transaction. We can take a look at that here in this AP bill. I was able to create an AP bill for Danforth Centers and tag it to one of my 41 grants in the system, and it's a $1,000 bill. Now, if I'm an organization that receives reimbursable grants, what I'll need to do at that point, if I'm just using the grant dimension, is I'm going to need to gather those reimbursements through reporting. So what I mean by that is if I came in to a general ledger report and I ran it for my current year, 12/31/2021, and I ran it for Danforth Center specifically, or sorry, outreach campaign specifically, which is my grant. And let's just say, actually, I want to run it from just my expenditures. I can view this GL report for 2021, and this is going to show me all of my expenditures that were tagged to that particular outreach campaign grant. And then when I need to create an invoice and get reimbursement for my expenses against this grant, I can utilize this GL report and provide that to the grantor in order to get my reimbursement. Again, that's the more manual way of handling things. Option 2 is the full grant tracking and billing module, which allows us to automate grant tracking and the reimbursement request process. And it also allows us to dynamically gather all of our amounts that weren't previously billed. And I will mention before I go into the details behind option 2, that if you are an organization that determines at the start of using Intacct that option 1 is applicable, but then later in your life, you decide that option 2 is applicable, you can always start with option 1 and scale to add option 2. So let's jump back into our grants here. And let's take a look at one of our grants that I've set up to use the full grant tracking and billing, which is this 401B. So we're going to see on this additional info tab here that I've done a couple things. Number one, I have marked this grant as having qualified time and expenses that are going to be billable back to a grantor. And I've also indicated which types of expenses I would like to bill back to the grantor. So that's going to be employee expenses, AP and PO. I can also mark timesheet entries or general ledger journal entries as qualified expenses and bill those back to the grantor. And how this works, if we take a look at some examples for this specific grant, here we have an expense report. So this is one of our types of expenses we might mark as qualified. And this expense report has been tagged to this grant, 401B, and it has also been marked as qualified. So this is just one example in an expense report. If we look at an AP bill for this same grant, here I've got my same grant here, 401B, $3,500 marked as a qualified expense. So with this grant tracking and billing module and with option number 2, I'm able to tag my expenses as reimbursable. And then what this allows me to do is use additional functionality, generate invoice functionality. And I can come in here, and we're going to see we can do this a variety of ways. We could run this report for all grants and all funders. We could filter by funder. But in this case, I just want to filter by that particular grant we've been looking at to see all of the unbilled expenses sitting out here. So other thing to note is I can also change the invoice date or GL post date if I'd like to. I'm just going to leave that as today's date for now. And we'll go ahead and preview. And what this is going to do is it's going to pull up all reimbursable expenses that pertain to this grant. So that includes, like I said earlier, timesheet entries, employee expenses, accounts payable expenses. Now, in this particular case, let's just say we just want to create an invoice for one of our employee expenses. We'll just say this $629 expense and maybe our AP bill down here for $3,500. We can select those two expenses and we can choose to create an invoice here. Now I get a notice that my grant time and expense invoice AR 00117 has been created. Let's go ahead and take a look at this invoice and just review what's happening here. So I've created an invoice that has debited AR and credited whichever revenue account I have set up. And this is for my employee expense that I selected and for my AP bill that we took a look at. I have full control over what I want these invoices to look like and what I want the emails to look like if I choose to send emails out of the system. So, for example, I'm going to print this. This is just going to be my boilerplate Intacct template. But again, this is fully customizable. So I can add a logo. I can change the colors on it. I can change the font on it. I can change the entire layout. It's fully customizable based on what I need my invoice to look like. And then the other thing that's fully customizable is the email that I'm going to receive if I'm a grantor that's receiving one of these invoices. So up here, we're just seeing a very, again, boilerplate example of an email that might get sent out, but we can fully customize the message, the thank you, the subject line based on what the grantor requirements are when they receive this particular invoice. So those are really your two options if you're a grant recipient that has those reimbursable expenses. Now let's take a quick look at just some general grant reporting. So I'm going to come out to my dashboards and I'm going to come out to a grant manager dashboard that I have here. And just wait for this to load. So we'll take a look at, we're not going to look at everything on this dashboard, but we're going to look at a few reports just so you get the idea of how reporting works in here, and then a couple other features. So up here at the top, I've got this grant positions report. Now, what this is showing me is my grants down the rows of the report. And I did this and I tagged this by creating transactions that hit these particular grants. In our columns, we're going to see our budgeted award amount, revenue booked, remaining draw, expenditures, remaining spend. So we're going to see all that financial information that pertains to each of these particular grants. If I drill into any one of these numbers, so for example, let's pull up this 1.221 million in expenditures. I'm going to see all of the transactions that make up that 1.221 million. But even further than that, I can actually drill into one of these numbers and it'll take me back to the source transaction. So here's this $2,300 bill. The reason that pulled into my report was because I tagged it to the particular grant that I had filtered that report for. And that's going to work the same way for any of these numbers. They're all hyperlinked and they're pulling into my report because I tagged them to these particular grants. If we take a look at another report here, just to get a bunch of ideas of what reporting can look like here. So this revenue and expenditures funder report, this is a report I've built for one particular grant, my health initiative grant. I can see the total amount received up here. I can even specify grant reporting period, and I can include both year 1 and year 2 of this grant. I'm seeing the revenue in this top section. I'm seeing the expenditures down here. I'm seeing my net rev over expenditures at the below. So I'm getting full insight into the grant that they received and how the organization has chosen to spend those funds. We'll take a look at 2 more reports on this dashboard before we move on here. Health Initiative 1, grant budget to actual. So in this particular case, I'm able to look at my budget for this particular grant and then my actuals that I've spent. And I'm able to call out with highlighting expenses that weren't budgeted for or allowed. So I can see here, I didn't budget for conferences, conventions, or meetings. My spend was $25,000. It gets called out with this nice red box. We won't go over this feature today, but I do want to note that there's also an additional feature in Intacct called spend management that will actually disallow you from even spending this $25,000 if your budget is 0. So just note that that's an additional feature. If you'd like to see that, reach out with the contact information on the last slide we're going to show today. And then a couple more things on this dashboard before I move on. CFA. So if you receive federal awards, you can build out CFA reports. So here's one right here just to see an example. And then last thing I'll mention from a dashboarding perspective, although there's a lot more on here, just want to cover highlights, statistical accounts. So some of our organizations, some of our nonprofit orgs that receive grants track statistical information about those grants, like, for example, number of grants received. So I have the ability to track those statistical pieces of information behind my grants that I'm receiving. We can see 26 with a smiley face because this is 24 more than we received in the prior year. All right, let's jump into grant restrictions. So let's say that we receive a grant that is temporarily restricted revenue. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to run a general ledger report, and I'm just going to run it for one particular period. And we'll run it for our Travis County grant. So in October of 2021, give this a second to load. So in October of 2021, we received a $50,000 grant from Travis County for this Travis County grant. If I click into this particular grant, or if I click into this particular number, I'm going to see that these funds that I received were marked as temporarily restricted. Now, in that same month that I received the grant, or this could even be in a future month that I received the grant, I start to spend against it. So if I come into here and look at this office supplies, 19,000, for example, I can see that I tagged a bill for $19,000 to that Travis County contract. So I've got $50,000 of temporarily restricted revenue that I received, but in that same month, I was able to spend $19,000 of that. So effectively, this $19,000 in revenue should be released from restriction. For all of our nonprofits, we're able to generate a restriction release. And what this looks like is I plug in the date that I want to post this release. I plug in what my temporarily restricted designation is, what my unrestricted designation is, and which particular grant I want to run this for. And the end result here in October of 2021 for this particular grant was that $19,000 was released from temporarily restricted and put into unrestricted. So instead of having to track this manually and run GL reports for this, I can just use this generate restriction release feature to capture any of those expenses that have subsequently or should subsequently move some of my previously restricted revenue into unrestricted. And then just to see what this looks like from a reporting perspective, because I think this is important. If we just take a look at this report, if we want to see the exact impacts of that grant that we just looked at, we received $50,000 from Travis County for this Travis County grant. At the moment, only 31,000 of it is still sitting in that temp restricted. The other 19 is now unrestricted. So that's how we can utilize the restriction features around any of those temporarily restricted grants. Okay, just a few more items to cover, and then we'll save the last 5 minutes here for questions. RevRec, so a lot of our nonprofits that receive grants use revenue recognition templates. So in Intacct, there's a variety of ways you can set these up. Let me come into my templates here. So we're going to see two templates in this demo environment. Streamline, we're not going to cover in much detail today, but if you are a nonprofit that receives tuition or memberships and you need to, for example, recognize 12 months of revenue across an annual membership, you can utilize revenue recognition and order entry templates for that. Today, we'll look at this milestone percent completed recognition template. So if we take a look at a grant we received from the Skousky Foundation. So let's say we've received a $500,000 grant, and while we've received the $500K up front, we can only recognize revenue as certain events take place. With nonprofit revenue management and Intacct, we're able to create events. So this 500K, we've broken into 5 lines based on various events that need to be completed in order for us to recognize this revenue. And if we click into, actually we'll click into our grant here, we can come out to the tasks tab and we can see that there are 5 different tasks or events that need to be completed. What the revenue recognition module allows us to do is to recognize revenue once these particular tasks have been marked as complete. So we have the ability to manage and post revenue schedules, and the system will recognize when these tasks have been marked as complete and only record that revenue once they have been marked as complete. You can also utilize this functionality in a project percent complete fashion, where maybe you have an entire project that's $500,000. As you come into the grant or project and you say 20% of it is complete, then you can generate revenue related to 20% of that, or you can do it the way I showed here, where you have various events or tasks and revenue is only recognized once those have been marked as complete. There's a variety of ways that we can handle that. All right, 2 more items I want to cover here, and then we'll get into as many questions as we can. Grant workflows. So if you're a grant receiving organization, there are a variety of ways you can set up your workflows. So for example, if I come in here, I'm going to see that I've got 29 transaction definitions set up here. In this particular demo environment, as it pertains to grants, I've got one workflow that maybe starts with a grant notification of award. Once that's created, then it's converted into a conditional award record, Maybe from there, it's converted into a conditional milestone schedule. In another case for this particular organization, I start with a grant notification of award, then maybe it immediately gets invoiced. This workflow is completely configurable based on your particular organization's needs. And I will say that across all the nonprofits I've implemented, you'll never find two that look exactly the same. There's always going to be nuances to your particular organization. These are all completely configurable and unique to you. The other piece that I'll cover here, and then we'll jump into questions, is multi-year grants that you're awarded. So one feature that my clients like a lot is the ability to take a grant. So let's say we receive this wellness and health fitness community center grant for $600,000. And this is really a 3-year grant. And we're going to need to invoice across 3 years, $200,000 each. We can create that initial grant notification of award. And then when we're ready to create the year 1 invoice, we can come in and say, let's go ahead and create our invoice. And in this particular case, we just want to invoice 1 year of this. So I'm going to change my quantity to 1 for $200,000. I'll go ahead and post that. And then I can come in and I can see my grant invoice here. So here's my $200,000 invoice for year 1, debiting accounts receivable, crediting grants income. But I'm still going to be able to come back into my original grant notification of award, and I'll see that it's partially converted because now there's only $400,000 of this left to convert in year 2, for example. So if I come in, I can say, now I want to do my next year. Maybe my next year is 129.26. I can plug that in and I can post it. And now my year 2 invoice is sitting out there along with my year 1 invoice. So here's year 1, here's year 2. That grant notification of award is going to be available for me to convert until it's been fully depleted and until I have converted all 3 years. So now when I come to my 3rd year, I've just got 200,000 left to convert. My final year is 129.27. I post it. And now my grant notification of award is completely converted. So I've utilized all $600,000 of that sitting out there. Alrighty, that was a lot. Let me just double check that I don't have any questions in my chat here. Yes, so someone asked for the restriction functions, do we have the option to choose all temp restricted grants that have expenses for the fiscal year to be released? Yes, you do have that option. I've got another question in here about grant fields. So that's a great question. Let me screen share here. Let's see. Okay, so as far as grant fields go, because I didn't cover much of that in detail, project ID and project name, those are just the basic fields, but then we're going to see all the way across here that we have plenty of other options for fields around a grant. So for example, grant or project type, a lot of our clients will label their grants as project or contract or grant or maybe event. So we can label each of these with a type. They don't all have to be labeled with grant. We can also use parent-child relationships. So we're going to see this here for Claremont Impact Study, where we have a project, and that project is funded by a contract and a grant. So we're able to use parent-child for that sort of structure. Some other fields we can use here. So project status or grant status, we could say, you know, the grant is active or it's completed or it's applied for. We can create as many statuses as we need and then assign those to grants. And then a couple others, begin date and end date. So that's an important one. You can plug that information in. So there are a number of fields on each particular grant that you can populate. And if there aren't fields that you need, we can always add custom fields very easily that allow us to add to capture any information that we might need for a particular grant. And I see one other question here. Grant making. So I got a question here on if Intacct can be used for grant making. If you're a nonprofit that's a grant making organization, the answer to that is yes. We didn't have time to cover that in detail today, but everything we covered today was an order entry, which would be if you're a grant recipient. We'll also see that we can use the purchasing module here for grant making organizations. So for example, Danforth Centers here is a grant, or they're making, this organization, Mission Peak, is creating a grant for Danforth Centers. It's a $10,000 grant. And then you can create workflows on the purchasing side as well. So in this case, this organization's workflow is a grant funding request. Then it becomes a grant invoice that they're paying out to Danforth Centers. And when it becomes that invoice, that's when it hits our grant payable and our grant award. Any other questions here? All right, let me pull up. So again, as I mentioned, if you have any questions that you think of around what I went over today, I'll have a slide at the end with information to reach out. At the end of the day, a lot of nonprofits pick Sage Intacct because of the grant management features, the real-time reporting that we saw today. A couple things we didn't cover that are also available for nonprofits are if you're multi-entity, there's automation around multi-entity and inter-entity. There are budgeting and planning features and a lot of advanced functionality that we can utilize. Let's see, I've got one more question maybe. Hey, Michelle, do you mind reading me the question? I'm having trouble seeing it. Oh, actually, here we go. When will we do a demo on grant creation? We don't have one on the calendar yet, but we'll certainly set one up probably sometime in the next 2 or 3 months. So we'll be sure to reach out with the scheduling on that. And let me just screen share this last slide here. If you do have questions about today's webinar, you can reach out to inquire@compudata.com. And with a minute to go, I think we've covered all questions. So thank you all so much for attending. We really appreciate you taking the time, and please reach out with any questions or comments on today's webinar. Ready? Thank you.